Born in Chains, the world that wasn't meant to change. A historically plausible true story, a tale of courage, survival, and the birth of a dangerous hope. They said the world was fixed, that some were born to command and others to obey. But in the cotton fields of Georgia, beneath the sky heavy with heat and dust, a boy named Elijah began to quietly prove them wrong. He was born in 1839 on the edge of a plantation near Macon, where the air hung thick with the scent of magnolia and misery. His mother Ruth was known among the enslaved for her steady hands and quiet strength. She'd whisper stories to him in the dark, stories about a land where men worked for themselves, where families weren't sold, and where skin didn't decide a man's worth. Elijah listened. He always listened. By the time he was 10, he could read the sky like a clock and the woods like a book. He knew which birds sang before dawn, which creeks ran north, and how to follow the stars even when the clouds tried to hide them. These were lessons no master had taught him, lessons passed down in whispers, in the songs the field hands hummed when the overseer wasn't listening. But Elijah's mind worked differently from most. He noticed things. When the overseer left the gate unlocked one evening, Elijah memorized the sound it made when it clicked shut. When the white men gathered on the porch, he listened to their talk about politics and rumors of war. He began to piece together the strange contradictions of his world, a place built on freedom but ruled by chains. The silent classroom. The plantation's main house was a place of shadow and privilege. Elijah was sent there at 12 to serve as a houseboy, cleaning boots, pouring whiskey, and running errands for his master, Colonel Barrett, a man who wore his pride like a medal. Barrett often boasted that his slaves were well-kept and obedient, words that made Elijah's stomach twist. But the house gave Elijah something more dangerous than comfort: knowledge. He learned to read, secretly, by watching the master's children with their books. At night, when everyone slept, Elijah would sneak scraps of newspaper from the trash and trace the letters by firelight. Freedom, he sounded out one night. The word felt heavy on his tongue, strange, forbidden, powerful. Sometimes he'd hear the colonel's guests talk about abolitionists, Yankees, and trouble up north. The men would laugh, confident the South would never fall. But Elijah could feel a tremor beneath their words, fear, perhaps, or the faint knowledge that the world they built might not last forever. A spark in the fields. By 1855, Elijah was 16 and already tall, with quiet eyes that seemed to see through lies. That summer, an old preacher named Brother Moses visited the plantation under the guise of a traveling carpenter. At night, he gathered the enslaved people near the cabins and spoke in code. He'd say, "The Lord's chariot runs north, and its wheels roll on the rivers and stars." To most, it sounded like scripture. To a few, it was a map. Moses taught them how to read the signs, how a quilt on a fence might point the way, how a lantern in a window could mean safety, and how songs like "Follow the Drinking Gourd" held directions in their lyrics. Elijah absorbed every word. One night, Moses handed him a worn Bible with initials carved inside. H.W. Harriet Walker. She's safe. If you ever reach Tennessee, find her. Elijah hid the Bible under his cot, heart pounding. It wasn't just a holy book now. It was a ticket to another world. The world tightens. As rumors of rebellion and abolition grew, the masters grew crueler. Barrett's temper sharpened. Whippings became public spectacles. Elijah watched friends disappear, sold down the river to pay debts. The older slave spoke of Nat Turner and John Brown in hushed tones, of men who dared to rise. In the winter of 1858, Barrett's oldest son discovered Elijah's secret, the Bible hidden beneath straw. Elijah was dragged to the yard, beaten, and locked in the smokehouse for 3 days without food. But even then, something inside him refused to die. Lying in the dark, he whispered to himself, "They can't chain what's in here." He tapped his head with trembling fingers. "They can't chain a mind." That was the moment the plan began, not of rage, but of strategy. Elijah would not run blindly. He would outthink the South.
The plan. Over the next year, Elijah became the perfect servant again. Quiet, obedient, invisible. He earned the master's trust, memorizing his routines. He learned when supply wagons left for Savannah, how long it took for hounds to track a scent, and which nearby creeks could drown the smell. When Union leaflets began circulating, smuggled in by Northern sympathizers, Elijah found one hidden in a stable wall. It spoke of freedom, wages, and the right to one's own life. That night, he decided. He would leave during the cotton harvest, when chaos ruled the fields. He would travel north by the river, guided by stars and by the secret marks Moses had taught him. And he would take with him one thing they could never reclaim, his name. The escape. It was a moonless night in August 1860. The air was thick, the crickets loud. Elijah slipped from his quarters with a sack of cornmeal and a strip of cloth tied around his wrist, his mother's gift. Every sound felt like thunder, every shadow like a hand. He moved through the woods, crossing creeks, hiding in hollow logs when the dogs bayed in the distance. For 7 nights he traveled, through swamps and briar, through hunger and fever. Once a patrol nearly caught him near the Oconee River. He escaped by wading chest-deep through black water while snakes hissed nearby. Finally, he reached a small farmhouse where a candle burned in the window, the signal Moses had promised. Inside was a white woman with gray hair and steady eyes. "You're safe now," she said. "Name?" "Elijah," he whispered. "Not anymore," she smiled. "Tonight, you're Henry Walker." Freedom's first breath. Weeks later, after being passed from one safe house to another, Elijah, now Henry, crossed into Cincinnati, Ohio, a free state. The air felt different. The sky seemed wider. But freedom came with its own ghosts. He couldn't forget those left behind. Ruth, Moses, the others who'd risked everything so he could stand where he stood. He joined a group of freedmen working with the Underground Railroad, using the same skills that had saved him: observation, patience, and courage. By the time the Civil War erupted, Henry Walker had helped dozens of others make their way north. Legacy of the boy from Georgia. Years later, when freedom was finally proclaimed, Henry stood beneath the northern sky and wept, not for himself, but for the millions who'd never see that dawn. He opened his old Bible, the one Moses had given him, and wrote a single line beneath the initials HW. Born in chains, but never owned. His story, once whispered in the dark, would travel across generations, the tale of a boy who listened, watched, remembered, and finally outwitted the South.
Whispers of the Underground, a map drawn in shadows. A historically plausible tale of courage, codes, and the secret paths to freedom. They said no map could lead to freedom, but in the cotton heartlands of Georgia, where every whisper could cost a life, one young man discovered a map written not in ink, but in faith, courage, and code. The year was 1857, and Elijah had already survived what broke most men. Born into chains, he had learned to hide his thoughts behind still eyes and a bowed head, but deep inside, his mind burned with quiet rebellion. Every lash, every command, every sermon on obedience had only taught him to listen differently. By then, the South was restless. Rumors drifted through the plantations like wind through tall grass, of abolitionists riding under cover of night, of Northern conspirators helping slaves disappear, of coded songs that pointed to the North Star. The masters called it treachery. The enslaved called it hope. Elijah was 18 when he met the man who would change everything, a traveling preacher known only as Reverend Josiah Reed, the stranger with the tattered Bible. Reverend Reed came riding through the plantation one humid afternoon, his coat dusty and his Bible worn to its bones. He claimed to be spreading the word of God among the faithful. Barrett, Elijah's master, welcomed him. A sermon, after all, kept the enslaved obedient. That evening, the field hands gathered beneath the pines, fireflies flickering like small spirits around them. Reed's voice rose and fell with practiced rhythm. The Lord delivers his children from bondage, and when the time comes, his people will know the way. Elijah's mother, Ruth, whispered Amen, but Elijah noticed something odd. When Reed spoke the words, the way, he traced a small mark on the corner of his Bible, a shape that looked almost like a river branching north. Later, as the sermon ended, Reed took Elijah aside. "Boy," he said softly, "can you read?" Elijah hesitated. To admit that was dangerous, but something in Reed's gaze felt safe. He said, "A little." Reed nodded and pressed the Bible into his hands. "Then read this when the moon is high," he whispered. "You'll find more than verses in there." By dawn, the preacher was gone. The hidden language. That night, Elijah opened the Bible beneath a flickering lantern. Between the brittle pages of Exodus, he found scraps of paper, torn edges covered in strange markings, triangles, circles, lines crossing like rivers. At first he thought nonsense, until he noticed letters, ST, AH, HW, and beside them names of towns, Augusta, Chattanooga, Nashville. It wasn't scripture. It was a map. Each mark represented a station on the Underground Railroad, a network of secret routes and safe houses that stretched from the Deep South to freedom in the North. And the initials? Those were the conductors, the brave souls who risked their lives to guide runaways across the border. Elijah traced the path with trembling fingers. One symbol, a small cross inside a circle, sat beside a name he knew, Harriet Walker. Brother Moses had spoken that name months before, the woman who kept a candle in her window for the lost. Freedom wasn't a rumor anymore. It was real, written in ink and faith, hidden inside the Word of God. The Whisper Network. Over the next months, Elijah became part of something larger than himself, an invisible brotherhood of whispers and signs. He passed the Bible to others who could be trusted. Old Ben, who sang coded hymns about Jordan rivers. Mary Ann, the seamstress who stitched secret messages into quilts. And Samuel, the blacksmith who hid marks beneath his forge. Each night they shared what they'd learned. A lantern in a window meant safe. 2 meant danger. A quilt hanging with a specific pattern, a log cabin or flying geese, pointed north. Elijah began keeping mental notes, a living map in his mind. He memorized routes that wound through the woods, through swamps and cane brakes, across creeks that masked footsteps. He wasn't running yet, not until the time was right. But when that time came, he'd lead not just himself, but others. Shadows on the wind. Then, one evening in 1858, everything changed. A patrol arrived from the neighboring county, hunting for a runaway woman said to be hiding nearby. They searched cabins, tore apart fields, and questioned every enslaved hand. That night, Barrett gathered everyone in the yard. He barked, eyes scanning the crowd. "Someone's helping them. And when I find out who, I'll make an example that'll last generations." Elijah stood silent, heart pounding. He knew that if the Bible was found, it would mean death, not just for him, but for everyone who'd seen it. He ran to the cabin, tore out the coded pages, and buried them beneath the roots of an old oak tree. The next morning, the preacher's Bible lay innocent on the shelf, its secrets swallowed by the earth. But the network lived on, because Elijah had memorized every mark, every name, every turn of the road. The map was no longer on paper, it was in him. The code comes alive. As months passed, whispers grew bolder. A young woman named Cora escaped from a nearby plantation. Elijah had seen her once, eyes bright as flame, her wrists still scarred from chains. When she appeared one night near the barn, shivering and barefoot, he knew the moment had come to act. He guided her to the edge of the forest, pointing north. He said, "Follow the Big Dipper. When you see a quilt with flying geese, turn east. There'll be a woman with a candle. Her name is Harriet Walker." Cora looked at him, tears glinting in the moonlight. "You sure about this?" Elijah smiled faintly. "I'm sure of freedom." Days later, word came through the grapevine. Cora made it across the Tennessee border, safe. For the first time, Elijah realized the truth. He wasn't just following the Underground Railroad. He had become part of it. The price of secrets. But freedom had a cost. A month later, a plantation hand named Jeremiah was caught carrying a marked scrap of fabric. Under torture, he confessed that a boy named Elijah knew about the preacher's Bible. Barrett was furious. He ordered a search. That night, Elijah's mother came to him, eyes full of fear. She whispered, "They're coming for you. Run, son. Run before dawn." Elijah wanted to stay, to protect her, but Ruth pushed him toward the woods. "Go. You carry the map now. Don't let it die with us." He ran. The dogs came within an hour. Torches burned behind him, shouts echoing through the trees. But Elijah knew the land better than they did. He crossed the creek barefoot, waded through the swamp to hide his scent, then followed the stars north. At dawn, exhausted and bleeding, he reached the old oak tree. Beneath it lay the buried pages. He unearthed them, clutched them to his chest, and whispered a promise. "You will not be forgotten." By the following night, Elijah had slipped beyond the county line. Every step north brought danger, slave catchers, hunger, cold, but also hope. The coded pages guided him from one safe house to another. In Alabama, a carpenter named Thomas sheltered him. In Tennessee, a Quaker woman handed him a new pair of boots and a loaf of bread. And finally, near Nashville, a lantern burned in the window of a small farmhouse. A woman opened the door. She was older than he'd imagined, with strong arms and kind eyes. She said, "You must be Elijah. Reverend Reed told me about you." He froze. "He's alive?" She nodded. Alive and still carrying the word. In that moment, Elijah understood. The preacher's Bible had never been just his. It was part of a living chain, passed hand to hand, mind to mind, heart to heart. The map that lived. Years later, long after the war began, Elijah, now calling himself Henry Walker, became one of the most skilled conductors on the Underground Railroad. He led families through forests by starlight, carried children across rivers on his back, and whispered the same words to them that Reed had once whispered to him. You'll find more than verses in there. By the time freedom finally came, the tattered Bible had passed through dozens of hands, its pages nearly gone, but its code lived on in every life it saved.
The Master's Game, Outsmarting the Hunters. A historically plausible true story of survival, intelligence, and freedom in the shadow of slavery. They said a slave's only weapon was obedience. But Elijah had learned the truth, that silence could be sharper than steel, and a bowed head could hide a plan years in the making. By 1859, the winds of war were whispering across the South. Talk of rebellion and northern interference stirred fear among the planters, and every plantation tightened its grip. Patrols grew stricter, punishments harsher, and rumors of the Underground Railroad were treated as treason. Yet, beneath this tightening noose, Elijah was quietly building something more dangerous than open revolt, a strategy. He had spent most of his youth in Colonel Barrett's big house, serving as a house servant, a position that offered both peril and privilege. He polished boots, cleaned silver, and poured bourbon for men who never once looked him in the eye. But while they drank and bragged about cotton profits and politics, Elijah listened and remembered. He memorized routes the overseers took when hauling goods to Savannah. He noted which nights the guard dogs were fed early, which gates were left unlatched, and which of Barrett's cousins was prone to falling asleep drunk at his post. He observed everything, said nothing. The art of survival disguised as servitude. He was playing the Master's game, and he was winning. The lessons of the big house. Inside the Barrett mansion, every object told a story. The maps in the colonel's study, thick parchment marked with rail lines and rivers, became Elijah's secret classroom. When he dusted the shelves, he would pause to study them, tracing the thin black lines that stretched northward. He learned the difference between the Savannah River and the Oconee. He noted where the old wagon trails met the main road. Every detail etched itself into his mind like scripture. The Barrett's guests, cotton brokers, militia officers, and neighboring planters, often spoke freely in his presence. To them, Elijah was invisible, part of the furniture. They spoke of bounty hunters tracking escapees, of new laws tightening restrictions on free blacks, and of the growing fear that the North will ruin everything. One night, as Elijah refilled glasses, he overheard something that made his pulse quicken. "The Reverend Reed's been seen again," one guest muttered, "preaching his poison about freedom and God's law. They say he's hiding near Augusta." Elijah froze. Reverend Josiah Reed, the man who had once left him a Bible filled with coded maps, the man who had started him on his journey toward freedom. He said nothing, just poured the whiskey, bowed, and left the room. But that night, beneath the cabin rafters, he whispered, "If he's still alive, then so is the road north." The art of pretending. Freedom required patience and deception. Elijah learned to wear masks better than the masters themselves. By day, he played the obedient servant, quick with "yes, sir," and "right away, ma'am." By night, he became a ghost, slipping through corridors, memorizing schedules, hiding scraps of food for the journey he knew was coming. He learned to forge small passes in Barrett's handwriting, brief notes authorizing travel between plantations. He never used them then, but he practiced until his imitation was perfect. When suspicion fell on others, he made sure it never fell on him. Once, a young field hand named Caleb was caught trying to flee. Barrett raged, certain someone had inspired the attempt. Elijah stood beside him as Barrett interrogated the others. His heart thundered, but his face remained calm. When the colonel turned to him, Elijah met his eyes and said softly, "Sir, I think Caleb's been restless ever since his wife was sold. Maybe he'd just lost his senses." The lie worked. Barrett sighed and nodded. "You're a good boy, Elijah." That's when Elijah learned the cruelest truth of all. Sometimes the only way to survive a monster is to make him trust you. The invisible network. Despite the constant fear, the whispers of the Underground Railroad never truly died. New faces appeared among the enslaved, men who claimed to have come from downriver, women whose songs carried coded directions. Elijah began to help them in quiet, careful ways. When a stranger arrived asking for the road to Jordan, Elijah knew what it meant. He would point to the stars, hand over food, and mark a small cross on a tree trunk 2 miles north of the plantation, a sign the next station was near. He never spoke names, never left notes. His greatest weapon was memory. The risk was unimaginable. Slave patrols, often drunk and armed, rode nightly. Anyone caught helping runaways was beaten, branded, or hanged. But Elijah had decided long ago he would rather die a free man than live a silent one.
A test of wits. In early 1860, Barrett's plantation received a visit from Captain Silas Haynes, a notorious slave hunter from Alabama. Haynes was tall, scarred, and ruthless, known for tracking fugitives across 3 states. When Haynes arrived, Elijah watched him carefully. The man spoke with a cruel smile and an arrogance born from blood money. He asked about recent troubles, about whispers of escape, about a preacher with a silver cross. Elijah's heart stilled. Haynes was hunting Reed. That night, as Elijah served supper, Haynes pointed a knife at him. "You hear things, boy? Your kind always does. Tell me, any talk about runaways lately?" Elijah forced a laugh, low and nervous. "No, sir. Folks here too scared for that. We seen what happens." Haynes grunted, pleased. "Good. You're smarter than most." Later, when the hunter retired drunk, Elijah slipped into his quarters. On the table lay a bundle of papers, wanted posters. One bore Reed's likeness. Another showed a young woman with bright eyes. Cora, the fugitive Elijah had once helped escape. He knew then that the hunters were closing in, and that he couldn't wait any longer. The counter-move. Elijah began preparing in earnest. Using scraps of chalk and charcoal, he drew maps beneath the floorboards of his cabin, memorizing every mile north to Tennessee. He began to influence the patrol routes subtly, offering to deliver letters, accidentally misplacing keys, even suggesting to the overseer that the dogs needed a day's rest. Each act looked harmless, but each opened a small window of freedom. When the moment came, he would be ready. His final move came unexpectedly. One evening, Barrett ordered Elijah to accompany Haynes on a short trip to inspect a neighboring plantation. The hunter boasted that he'd soon sniff out another runaway. But Elijah saw opportunity. As they rode along the forest road, Elijah pretended to stumble, dropping a saddlebag. When Haynes dismounted to retrieve it, Elijah struck, not with violence, but with distraction. He pointed into the woods. "Thought I saw someone running, sir." Haynes barked an order and charged into the trees with musket in hand. Elijah seized the horse's reins and spurred it south, away from the plantation, toward the river. He rode until the moon rose high, then left the horse by the water and disappeared into the forest. By dawn, Captain Haynes was still searching the wrong direction. Elijah, meanwhile, was already 3 counties away. The mind over the chain. For weeks, Elijah moved like a shadow, sleeping by day, walking by night. He avoided roads, followed streams, and survived on berries and cornmeal. At every stop, he used the old code signs, crossed branches, carved circles, and song lines whispered under his breath. The hunters were close. Twice he saw torches flickering in the distance, but they never found him. He was no longer just a fugitive. He was a strategist in a war of wits. When he finally crossed into Tennessee, he recognized one of the marks from Reed's map, a circle with a cross inside. It led him to a small farm where an elderly woman opened the door and said, "You've come far, son. Reverend Reed told us to expect a clever one." For the first time, Elijah smiled, not as a servant, but as a man who had mastered the game. The legacy of strategy. In the years that followed, Elijah, now going by Henry Walker, became one of the Underground Railroad's most brilliant tacticians. He trained others how to read maps, avoid hunters, and think like their enemies. He used the same principles that had once kept him alive: observation, patience, and the courage to pretend when the truth was too dangerous to speak. By the time the Civil War broke out, Henry had helped dozens reach freedom. His name never appeared in history books, but his methods, the art of outsmarting the hunters, became part of the railroad's quiet legend.
The night of disappearance, crossing the line between life and death. A historically plausible story inspired by true accounts of self-liberated slaves in the American South. The storm came without warning. A growl of thunder rolling across the Georgia sky like a warning from heaven. The air was thick with the smell of rain and iron, and the darkness felt alive, trembling with energy. Somewhere beyond the oak trees and the muddy cotton fields, a single figure waited, heart pounding, breath steady, eyes fixed on the horizon. That night, Elijah Johnson would attempt what few dared even to dream, an escape from the South, from slavery, from everything that had bound his life since birth. The dogs would be set loose, the men would mount their horses, the swamps would flood with danger, But Elijah had planned for this night for years, studied it, memorized it, and waited for the sky itself to hide his tracks. The calm before the hunt. For months, Elijah had played the role of the obedient servant. He carried messages between the big house and the neighboring plantations, served whiskey to white men at the long tables, and fixed broken harnesses in the stables. No one suspected him of anything but silent submission. But behind that quiet gaze, a storm had been building, one made not of fear, but of memory and calculation. He knew the routes the patrollers took each night. He had mapped the timing of their lanterns by the position of the moon. He knew which dogs were old, which men drank too much, and which fence post along the western boundary had a loosened plank. Knowledge, he had learned, was the only weapon the enslaved were ever allowed to carry. It was that knowledge, collected piece by piece over years, that would guide him tonight. A signal from the sky. By dusk, the storm clouds had gathered thick as smoke. The first drops of rain hit the wooden roof of the slave quarters like the ticking of a clock. It was time. Elijah stood by the door, one hand on the latch, waiting for the thunder to mask the sound of his first steps toward freedom. In his pocket, wrapped in oilcloth, was the tattered Bible he'd found months earlier, the one left behind by the traveling preacher. Inside, scrawled between the pages of Exodus, was a list of symbols, a star, a river, a circle with 3 lines. He now understood them for what they were, coded instructions from the Underground Railroad. The circle with 3 lines meant safe house. The river meant follow north. The star, the North Star, was the key to everything. As lightning split the sky, Elijah slipped into the night. The chase begins. It didn't take long for the alarm to spread. One of the hounds had caught his scent near the stable, and within minutes voices were shouting in the rain. Lanterns flickered to life. The overseer's horn sounded, a low, terrible call that meant one thing: a runaway. But Elijah was ready. He had spread lard mixed with pepper along the trail behind him, throwing the dogs into confusion. He moved through the swamp barefoot, his skin bleeding from the reeds, but his steps silent. Every sound around him, every frog croak, every rustle of leaves became both threat and guide. He reached the creek just as the rain began to pour in sheets. The current was high, but he stepped into it without hesitation. The cold bit into him, but the water would wash away his scent. He waited until the bank disappeared from sight, then followed the stream northward, keeping low beneath the storm-racked branches. Behind him, the voices grew faint. The dogs howled, then faded. For a moment, Elijah thought he had won, but freedom was not yet his.
The river of no return. Hours passed. The rain slowed, but the night remained thick with fog. Elijah stumbled onto a dirt road, his legs trembling from exhaustion. In the distance, he saw a faint light, a cabin perhaps. He hesitated. It could be a safe house, or it could be a trap. He remembered the preacher's words whispered months ago. Not every light means salvation. Sometimes the Lord hides his angels in darkness. So Elijah stayed hidden. He waited until dawn's first hint of gray touched the sky, then moved again, following the distant sound of a river. If the symbols in the Bible were true, the Chattahoochee lay ahead, the line between the world he knew and the one he hoped for. But the river was swollen from the storm, roaring like an angry beast. To cross it meant gambling everything. Behind him, he could already hear faint barking. The dogs had picked up the trail again. He didn't think. He ran. The water slammed into him like a wall. The current pulled, twisted, and dragged him under. His lungs burned. His body screamed for air. For one terrible moment, he thought he would drown within sight of freedom. Then, by sheer will, he clawed his way to the far bank, collapsing in the mud. When he opened his eyes, he realized the dog's howls had stopped. The river had swallowed his scent and his past. The silent morning. As dawn broke over the misty forest, Elijah felt the first true quiet of his life. No overseer's horn, no whip cracking in the fields, only the soft hum of the woods waking up. He lay there, shivering and half-conscious, but alive. He knew this was just the beginning. Ahead lay miles of unknown land, slave catchers, treacherous travelers, the risk of starvation. But the hardest line had been crossed. He had left behind the world that claimed to own him. From this point forward, each step would be his own. The legend that followed. Weeks later, whispers began spreading through the nearby plantations. They said a slave had vanished during the storm, slipped past the dogs, crossed the river, and disappeared into the north. Some said he drowned. Others said he'd joined the abolitionists and was helping others escape. In truth, Elijah had reached a safe house near Columbus, where a Quaker couple gave him food, dry clothes, and a new name. From there, he followed the coded messages hidden in quilts and letters, moving from one station of the Underground Railroad to the next. By the time he crossed into Ohio, his story had already begun to travel back down south, being carried in whispers, songs, and secret prayers. They called him the man who fooled the hounds. But Elijah never saw himself as a legend. He was a man who had learned to turn silence into strength, fear into focus, and darkness into freedom. Epilogue: Freedom in the Fog. Years later, Elijah would recall that night not for the terror, but for what it taught him. That freedom is never given. It is taken by those who dare to believe they deserve it. The night of his disappearance had been more than an escape. It was a declaration. Each thunderclap had been a drumbeat of rebellion, each drop of rain a baptism into a new life. And though history would never record his name in any official book, his footsteps, washed away in the storm, became part of the long, defiant trail that led a people from bondage to freedom.
Northbound secrets among friends and foes. The train of freedom was invisible. No tracks, no engines, no whistles, only whispers, courage, and faith. For Elijah Johnson, that train ran through the dark woods of the South, across swollen rivers, and into a world that promised liberty, yet hid dangers at every turn. He had escaped the slave patrols of Georgia, crossed the roaring Chattahoochee, and now wore the clothes of a free man. But in 1857 America, freedom was not a destination. It was a disguise that could shatter at a single wrong word. The road to nowhere. Elijah walked north beneath a gray sky, the hem of his borrowed coat heavy with mud. A kind Quaker couple near Columbus had given him new clothes, rough wool trousers, a faded shirt, and a brown hat that shadowed his face. They had even pressed a folded paper into his hand, a free pass, forged with careful ink strokes and trembling courage. Travel only by night, the Quaker woman had warned, her voice soft but urgent. The Lord guides the good, but men hunt the lost. He had thanked her, though he didn't yet believe in such guidance. Freedom, he was learning, was a path without certainty, one lined with both angels and predators. By day, he hid in barns, hollow trees, or the abandoned cabins that dotted the edges of the backcountry. By night, he followed the river north, the stars above his only companions. The North Star, steady, unblinking, was the same one that had hung above the plantations. But here it meant something different. It meant hope. The stranger by the fire. On the fifth night, hunger gnawed so deep that Elijah could no longer ignore it. He approached a small campfire deep in the woods where a man sat roasting corn and humming a tune that might have been a hymn. The man was white, thin, with a beard that glowed red in the firelight. "Evening," the man said without looking up. "You lost, friend?" Elijah froze. The word friend sounded both warm and dangerous. "Just passing through," he replied, his voice steady but cautious. The man's eyes flicked up. "Passing through, huh? Not many travel these woods by night unless they're running from something." A long pause followed, long enough for the fire to crackle between them. Then the stranger smiled faintly. "Sit down, son. You look half-starved." Elijah hesitated, then lowered himself slowly beside the fire. The man handed him a piece of corn and spoke quietly. "You got someone waiting for you up north?" "Maybe, if I can make it." The man nodded, studying him carefully. "You'll find folks willing to help you. Some will ask nothing, some will ask too much. You'll need to know the difference." He reached into his coat and drew out a small scrap of cloth, a patchwork square, red and blue, with a pattern of triangles. "If you see a quilt like this hanging on a fence, it means safe passage, house of friends. Remember that." When Elijah looked up again, the man was already fading into the darkness beyond the firelight, as if he had never been there at all. Among the kind and the cruel. Days turned into weeks. Elijah crossed from Georgia into Tennessee, then through Kentucky where the land rose into green hills and fog-shrouded valleys. He found help in unexpected places, a preacher's wife who left bread and salt pork beneath the church steps, a blacksmith who let him sleep in the hayloft and handed him a new pair of boots without a word. But he also met those who smiled with one hand and held a bounty poster in the other. In Lexington, he nearly lost his freedom again. A man in a gray coat approached him on the street, holding out a paper. "You there, you got your free papers?" Elijah's pulse quickened. He forced a calm expression, pulling the forged document from his pocket. The man glanced at it, frowning. "Looks mighty clean for a field hand," he said. Elijah met his gaze. "Got it renewed 2 months ago, sir. My employer in Columbus keeps his men proper." The man studied him for a long moment, then grunted and walked away. Only when the sound of boots faded did Elijah allow himself to breathe. The forged paper shook in his hand. The lie had held, barely.
The abolitionist's farm. One rain-soaked evening, Elijah stumbled upon a farm whose barn door stood open, a lantern flickering inside. He almost turned away, fearing a trap, but the exhaustion in his bones outweighed the caution in his mind. A woman appeared in the doorway, middle-aged, wearing a shawl and holding a candle. "You'd best come in," she said softly, "before the neighbors see you." Her name was Abigail Turner, a widow who had once hidden runaway slaves beneath her floorboards. Her late husband had been part of the Underground Railroad, and she had carried on the work in secret. "You'll rest here tonight," she said, guiding him to a corner of the barn where quilts were stacked. "Tomorrow a man will come in a wagon of apples. You'll ride with him to Cincinnati. From there, you'll cross the river." Elijah looked at him in disbelief. "Why do you help us?" She smiled sadly. "Because freedom belongs to everyone, though some men forget it." That night, for the first time in weeks, Elijah slept without fear. He dreamed of open skies and a world without chains. The false sanctuary. 2 days later, he rode in the back of a wagon beneath layers of straw and apples, just as Abigail had arranged. The driver was a tall, quiet man named Samuel, who spoke little and kept his hat low.
They traveled north through back roads and rain, avoiding towns. But when they stopped at a crossroads to rest, Elijah overheard voices, harsh, urgent whispers. "You sure he's the one?" "Looks like him. Big reward, too." His blood ran cold. Samuel's shadow moved outside the wagon, and then silence. Elijah reached for the side of the cart, ready to flee, but the tarp lifted. "Go," Samuel hissed. "They're coming. Take the woods east. There's a creek. Follow it till you see a red barn. Don't stop." For a moment, Elijah didn't move. Then he caught sight of the riders approaching, bounty hunters. Their faces were hidden beneath oilcloth hats, rifles gleaming in the rain. Elijah bolted. Bullets cracked through the trees. He ran until his lungs screamed, dove into the creek, and let the current carry him through the reeds. When he finally crawled onto the bank, soaked and trembling, the hunters were gone. Samuel had saved him, at the cost of his own safety. Elijah never saw him again. The Mason-Dixon line. Weeks later, the air grew colder, the trees taller, the nights quieter. Elijah had made it to Pennsylvania, the North. But freedom, he discovered, was not a single step across a line. The Fugitive Slave Act still reached here. He worked odd jobs on a farm near Lancaster, keeping his head down, earning enough to buy passage farther north to New York. But even among free men, he felt the weight of caution. One evening, a local abolitionist named Thomas Garrett, a real figure of history, known for aiding over 2,000 fugitives, passed through town. Elijah met him briefly at a church gathering. Garrett looked him in the eye and said, "You've come far, son, but freedom isn't just running. It's standing tall once you've arrived." Those words struck deep. For so long, Elijah had lived in shadows, silent and unseen. But now, standing beneath a northern sky, he felt the stirrings of something new: dignity. The man who believed. Months later, Elijah crossed into New York State and took work at a printing shop owned by abolitionists. He began writing letters to others still enslaved in the South, disguised as sermons or coded messages. The same Bible that had once guided his escape became his new tool for guiding others. He no longer ran, he helped others run. And yet, sometimes at night, when the wind rustled through the trees, he could still hear the baying of hounds in the distance, a reminder of the world he had left behind and the courage it took to walk away from it. Freedom, he had learned, was not simply crossing the Mason-Dixon line. It was learning to believe that he deserved to be there.
The man who changed his name. Freedom's New Dawn. A historically plausible Underground Railroad story inspired by true 19th century freedom narratives. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of northern dawn that painted the world in pale gold and silver mist. A man stood on a hillside outside Rochester, New York, watching the first rays of light break through the clouds. His hands, calloused, steady, once bound by iron, now held a pen instead of a plow. His name, written on the papers in his pocket, was Elijah North. But that wasn't the name he was born with. Once, in the cotton fields of Georgia, he had been called Elijah Johnson, property, not person. A name whispered by his mother and shouted by his master. A name chained to a life he'd buried miles behind him. Yet here, under the northern sky, he had done what few men in his time could imagine. He had rewritten himself into freedom. And his story, though the world might never print it in books, would ripple quietly through generations like a hymn carried on the wind. The weight of a new name.
Freedom, Elijah discovered, was not a moment. It was a process, slow, painful, and filled with contradictions. After escaping through the Underground Railroad and settling in New York, he found himself in a strange limbo. The law said he was free, but the world around him still carried the echoes of chains. Many in the North looked at him with suspicion. Some whispered, others pitied him. He'd won his liberty, but not yet his place. He began working at a printing shop run by abolitionists, men and women who risked everything to fight for the freedom of others, still enslaved. Among them was Frederick Douglass, the towering voice of the movement, a man who had once worn chains himself. He met him one winter evening when Douglass visited the shop to review a pamphlet on the Fugitive Slave Act. "You've got sharp eyes," he said, glancing over the newly printed pages. "Ever think of using them for more than typesetting?" Elijah smiled faintly. "I've used them to find my way here, sir. I reckon I'll keep using them to help others do the same." It was then that he decided to change his name. The name Johnson had belonged to his master. It was a brand that carried pain, loss, and servitude. North, he thought, meant something new, direction, purpose, and possibility. From that day forward, he became Elijah North, a man reborn in ink and courage. The secret work. By 1860, the tension between North and South was reaching a peach fever. Slave catchers prowled even northern towns, empowered by the fugitive slave law to drag escaped men and women back into bondage. Elijah knew the danger intimately. He had seen the terror in the eyes of those who came to the shop seeking forged papers, safe routes, or news from loved ones still trapped in the South. He joined a quiet network of men and women who ran one of the last active stations of the Underground Railroad in upstate New York. Hidden beneath his small home was a crawl space lined with straw, enough for 3 or 4 people to hide until nightfall. He worked by day setting type and printing pamphlets that carried anti-slavery sermons and speeches. By night, he printed something else. Coded messages disguised as religious verses or directions hidden inside Scripture. Each time someone passed safely through, he marked it in a secret ledger under a false name. Over the years, that book filled with hundreds of such names, lives reclaimed, families restored, courage reborn. Freedom, he realized, was contagious. The war that changed everything. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Elijah faced a new kind of choice. He was nearly 40 now, old enough to remember the lash, young enough to fight. Some freedmen joined the Union Army outright. Others served as scouts or guides. Elijah volunteered as a courier, carrying intelligence and maps through the border states for the Union cause. He traveled through Maryland, Pennsylvania, and back down through Kentucky, always moving, always listening. It was dangerous work, but he was no stranger to danger. Each mission felt like a continuation of his journey north, only now he wasn't running from something. He was running for something.
The return south. After the war ended in 1865, Elijah did what few former fugitives dared. He went back south. Georgia was broken, fields burned, towns half-emptied, masters humbled but unrepentant. He traveled quietly, posing as a teacher for freedmen's schools established by the Freedmen's Bureau. In truth, he sought something deeper, closure. He found the plantation where he'd once lived. The house stood empty now, its white columns cracked, the fields overgrown. The overseer's shed had collapsed under the vines. He walked the land in silence, remembering the voices of those who had not survived to see freedom. His mother, his brother, the friends whose names he could no longer speak without pain. Kneeling in the dirt, he whispered, "We made it." Then, gathering a handful of Georgia's soil, he wrapped it in cloth and tucked it into his coat pocket. He would carry that soil back north, a piece of the world that had once claimed him, now held on his own terms. Building a legacy. Back in Rochester, Elijah helped establish a small literacy school for newly freed families who had migrated north after the war. Many could not read, but all carried dreams. He taught children to form their letters, A, B, C, just as he once traced symbols in the dirt as a boy. He told them, "Reading is the second freedom. The first you must take with your feet, the second with your mind." He also began writing his own story, not for fame, but for remembrance. In 1872, he printed 50 copies of a small pamphlet titled "The Road I Walked by Night." It was not polished prose, but truth told plainly. How a boy born in bondage had outwitted his masters, crossed the river, and built a new life under a new name. Copies of that pamphlet found their way into churches, abolitionist meetings, and libraries across the North. A few still exist today. Brittle, anonymous, the author listed simply as E. North. The quiet ending. By the 1880s, Elijah North was an old man. His hair had turned silver, his hands arthritic from decades of labor. Yet he still rose before dawn to sit by the window and watch the sky brighten, the same way he had on that first morning of freedom. Neighbors knew him as a kind teacher, a quiet storyteller, and a man who never missed church on Sundays. Few knew his past. Fewer still guessed that beneath his calm eyes lay memories of a world chained and cruel. One winter evening, as snow fell softly over the town, a young student asked him, "Sir, were you ever afraid?" Elijah smiled, his gaze distant. "Every day. But freedom," he said slowly, "isn't the absence of fear. It's the choice to walk anyway." When he died the following spring, the townspeople buried him on a hill overlooking the Genesee River. His gravestone read simply, "Elijah North, 1818 to 1886, free at last." The whisper that lived on. Generations later, a teacher in a Rochester school would find one of Elijah's old pamphlets, yellowed and half-faded, in the corner of a library shelf. She would read it aloud to her students, the story of a man who changed his name, his fate, and perhaps the meaning of freedom itself. And as the children listened, eyes wide, one would whisper, "He didn't just escape, did he? He changed history." And in a way, he had. Because Elijah North, once Elijah Johnson, had not simply run from bondage. He had outwitted an entire system built to erase him, proving that freedom was not granted by men or papers, but forged in the fire of will. His was a story of transformation, courage, and quiet defiance, one that continues to echo across time, reminding us that every dawn of freedom begins with a single step into the unknown.